Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Inshallah, in today's lecture, we are going to talk about what happens when we forget things in prayer. Remember, we talked about the prayer including three components: the arkan, the sunan, and the hayat. So inshallah we are going to talk about what happens if we forget a rukn, what happens if we forget sunnah, what happens if we forget a hay'ah. Of course, if we forget anything from the essential components of the prayer on purpose, the fact that we do something on purpose to mess up the prayer renders the prayer batil, invalid. So here our conversation will be premised on what happens if we forget. What happens if we forget a rukn? What happens if we forget sunnah? Also, what happens if when we forget the rukn and the sunnah and we're praying by ourselves versus what happens when we forget the rukn and the sunnah and we're praying in a congregational prayer. Of course, this will roll itself into the conversation that talks about sajda to sahu, the sajda of forgetfulness, which in the Shafi'i madhab takes place after the last tashahud, before the taslim. Of course, there's some differences of opinions with the other madhab, but for us it takes place after the tashahud, before the taslim, keeping in mind that the sajdatay as-sahu, the two sajda of the sahu itself is a sunnah. So if somebody were so forgetful that they even forgot to do that, then their prayer would not be valid. We will also bring into the conversation again the hadith of Dhul Yadayn, which we used in a previous lecture to talk about the number of words that is valid to speak unintentionally in the prayer. In this context, we will return to that hadith to look at the time period that is allowable for us to go back and make up a rak'ah of things that we have missed in the prayer. So there are all of these different combinations. Of course, because of the nature of this class, we won't talk about all those combinations, but hopefully we'll talk about enough of them. Following that, we will begin but not complete the discussion on the times where prayer is unlawful, when it is haram to pray. These haram to pray without a reason. Without a reason, that's an important qaid, that's an important qualification, in which we will spend a lot of time in the beginning talking about what that qualification means. And then once we have cleared our understanding of that qualification, then we will see that based on certain traditions and verses of the Quran, these are certain times of the day in which the prayer itself, for no reason, is forbidden. And then that conversation will carry on to the following lecture, inshallah, at which time we will finish it, bi'idhnillah. So let us begin the way we usually begin, which is turning to the Arabic text of Abi Shuja radiallahu anhu, and then looking at some of the adillah. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في سجود السهو. والمتروك من الصلاة ثلاثة أشياء: فرض وسنة وهيئة. فالفرض لا ينوب عنه سجود السهو، بل إن ذكره والزمان قريب أتى به وبنى عليه وسجد للسهو. والسنة لا يعود إليها بعد التلبس بالفرض، لكنه يسجد للسهو عنها. والهيئة لا يعود إليها بعد تركها ولا يسجد للسهو منها. وإذا شك في عدد ما أتى به من الركعات بنى على اليقين وهو الأقل وسجد للسهو. وسجود السهو سنة ومحله قبل السلام. فصل في الأوقات التي تكره الصلاة فيها. وخمسة أوقات لا يصلى فيها إلا صلاة لها سبب: بعد صلاة الصبح حتى تطلع الشمس، وعند طلوعها حتى تتكامل وترتفع قدر الرمح. That is as much as we will read for today, inshallah. So let us look at the English translation quickly. Forgetfulness during prayers. So he says, radiallahu anhu, there are three types of actions that might be omitted in prayer. Meaning there are three types of things that can be omitted in prayer. The obligatory, which in our nomenclature is al-arkan, the rukn. recommended, which in our nomenclature is the sunnah, and lesser recommended acts, which in our nomenclature is the hay'ah. Of course, there's nothing wrong with studying fiqh in other languages other than Arabic, but it's important that the key terms, the key mustalahat, we always know what their Arabic original are. The obligatory, meaning if we miss an obligatory, the prostration for forgetfulness does not take its place. Instead, if one remembers it soon after its omission, one performs the action, continues the prayer, and makes a prostration of forgetfulness. Recommended, one does not return to a recommended action after engaging in an action that is obligatory. One does, however, make a prostration for forgetfulness for its omission. Lesser recommended actions, one does not return to a lesser recommended action after its omission, nor make a prostration for forgetfulness for its omission. If one doubts, or if one has doubts concerning how many rak'ats one has completed, one takes the certain number, the least of the possibilities, so the lesser number, prays the rest, and performs the prostration of forgetfulness. The prostration of forgetfulness is recommended, and the location of the prostration for forgetfulness is before saying the closing Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Times where prayer is unlawful. It is unlawful to perform a prayer that lacks a cause concurrent with or arising prior to the prayer's performance during 5 times. We are going to take 2 for this lesson. Number 1 is after the dawn prayer until the onset of sunrise, and number 2 from the onset of sunrise until its completion and the sun has risen 1 spear length above the horizon. Now let us return to the adillah. Okay. Sajdatul Sahw. Abu Hurairah narrates, radiallahu anhu, as is found in Bukhari, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam prayed with the Sahaba Dhuhr and Asr, and then made salam, and then Dhul Yadayn said, the hadith of Dhul Yadayn. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam returned to the prayer, completed the prayer, and then did the Sajdatul Sahw. Okay, so this is a dalil that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam had omitted a series of arkan, which is the last 2 rak'ahs over 4 rak'ah prayer. So because there is no travel indicated in the hadith text, then there is no dispensation for shortening the prayer. Hence the question of Dhul Yadayn, aqasarat as-salah, has it become shortened, am nisit, or did you forget? Of course, the Prophet ﷺ negates both, because the Prophet ﷺ does not forget the way we forget, but rather the qadr of Allah Ta'ala has descended upon him, and he is engrossed in the anwar of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and this was happened in order for it to teach us. So us forgetting, it might look the same, but it's completely different with respect to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and that has to do with our theological understanding of the Anbiya and of their isma alayhim assalam. Anyway, so as I said in the beginning, we will return to the hadith of Dhul Yadayn. It's a powerful hadith in the prayer, it comes up frequently. We also have the hadith of Abdullah ibn Bahina radiallahu anhu, as is narrated in Bukhari, that the Prophet ﷺ prayed 2 rak'ahs with them. He prayed the 4 rak'ah prayer, but did not sit in the 2nd rak'ah for the tashahhud. So we all rose with him. So then after the prayer, he did the 2 sajdat of sahw to compensate for leaving out the sunnah, which was the tashahhud. Okay. About forgetting and building on what you know, we have the hadith of Abi Sa'd al-Khudri, who narrates that the Prophet ﷺ said, if one of you doubts in your prayer, and not knowing is it 3 rak'ahs or 4, do away with the doubt and build on what is certain, meaning the lower number, because if you doubt, the certainty will be in the lower number. Build on that and then do the 2 rak'ah of sahw. And then if you happen to end up praying 1 extra rak'ah, so instead of 4 you ended up praying 5, that is an extra reward for you. As far as for us as the Shafi'is, the sahu, the two prostrations of forgetfulness taking place after the last tashahhud before the taslim, we have the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim by Ibn Sa'id al-Khudri. I heard that the Prophet ﷺ say, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong dalil. We would be back with the hadith of Dhul Yadayn. That would be the dalil for that. As far as the two times that I got into for mentioning the haram time to pray, because it's a small section, so I can add it to this clip. The first one we said about praying after you finish Fajr prayer until the sun rises, and then actually at the time of the sunrise. That's the hadith that I was about to recite in Bukhari and Muslim, narrated by Sa'id al-Khudri, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu, that he heard the Prophet ﷺ say, if you have prayed the Fajr prayer, then do not pray until the sun rises, and do not pray after Asr prayer until the sun sets, which will come into the Asr prohibition, which we will talk about in the next prayer. Technically, the hadith of Abdullah ibn Bahina, that is narrated in Bukhari, that specifically says that the sajda to sahu took place after the tashahhud before the taslim. كبر قبل التسليم فسجد سجدتين وهو جالس ثم سلم. So he finished the tashahhud, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, the two sajdat of sahw, and then Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Okay, so these are some of the adillah that will concern, again, like I always I know I'm repetitive, but this is not an exhaustive list of adillah, but at least you have some working notion that these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind as we pray. Now, this is a clip that we will definitely want to pay attention, all of us, because unfortunately these are things that happen very frequently, mistakes in the prayer, and it behooves us. Now, the thing I said about the Prophet ﷺ forgetting, he actually, Al-Bayjuri opens up this chapter quoting Ibn Arabi in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, talking about any type of tanzih, or warding off any type of notion that the Prophet ﷺ sort of was weak in mind and was deficient. And that's very important, that even in a class of fiqh we remind ourselves of the maqam of the Prophet ﷺ, because we want our Islam to be cohesive and coherent together, and all of it orthodox, inshallah. Alright, so let us go and let's dissect some of this. He says, okay, so there are three types of things that we can forget in the prayer. Either you're going to miss a rukn, or a sunnah, or a hay'ah. As I said in the introductory clip, if you miss anything on purpose, if you miss a rukn on purpose, or if you miss a sunnah on purpose, that will invalidate the prayer. So anything with, I don't know why you would want to do that, but it's important that we mention it in the dars, so we understand that that's actually part of how our fiqh works. So here, obviously the things that we are about to talk about are the things that happen by accident, sahu. And that happens sometimes. You're tired, or you're sick, or you go to a new place to pray, or you're in a new environment, or you're reciting something new from the Quran, or the prayer is very long or very short than what you're used to. A whole host of scenarios that we can make up that would cause somebody to become forgetful. Or you're a new Muslim, or you have just come back to practicing the deen, whatever. So we're always going to keep in mind these three categories of the arkan, the sunan, and the hay'ah. The arkan, basically, you have to go back to them. So the sajdatay sahu, the two sajda of sahu, of forgetfulness, does not compensate for a missed rukn. It is because you have introduced an aspect of forgetfulness to the prayer. So if I've missed a rukn in the prayer, the minute I remember it, I have to go back to that rukn and then keep going. And because of that stutter step, I make the sajdatay as-sahw. Not that the sajdatay as-sahw compensates for it. If I leave out a sunnah, such as the middle tashahud or dua al-qunut in Fajr prayer or dua al-qunut in the last 15 nights of Ramadan in the witr prayer, or if I leave off praying on the Prophet ﷺ and his family in the tashahud, these are the sunnahs in the Shafi'i madhab, then the sajdatay as-sahw is done as a compensation for that which you have missed. And of course, when it comes to the hayat, there is no no sin in missing them, and there's nothing to compensate for them. There's only reward in doing them. Okay, so that's why he spent so much time, or we spent so much time in the beginning, trying to elaborate the different types of the arkan, the sunan, and the hayat. Okay, so let's go one by one. The obligatory, the arkan, the prostration of forgetfulness does not take its place. Okay, so you cannot just say, oh, I'll just do the sajdatay as-sahw and that will compensate. It doesn't count. You have to do all of the arkan, and each rak'ah have to be completed. Instead, if one remembers it soon after its omission, one performs the action, continues the prayer, and makes a prostration for forgetfulness. So I'm praying, and some of these examples are going to be crazy, but just so we understand. So I stand to pray, and I forget to recite the Fatiha. So I say, Allahu Akbar, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad, Allahu Akbar. And then, Sami Allahu liman hamida. And then I'm like, wait a second, I didn't recite the Fatiha. At that moment, I put my hands back and I say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and I recite the Fatiha, and then I keep going, as if those previous motions didn't happen. Or if I remember it later in the prayer, let's say I get to the sujood and I remember it. Let's say, and again, I understand this is a wild example, but let's say in this example that I forgot to recite the Fatiha, I didn't remember until the third rak'ah. So now some distance has passed in that case. So what I would do is I would build on what I have already done, so that first rak'ah doesn't count at all because there was no Fatiha in it. So the second rak'ah I prayed was really the first rak'ah, and the rak'ah that I'm in now is really the second rak'ah. So I would stand and I would do 2 more rak'ahs in that fashion. That's even a little bit more peculiar. Or if I salam and I finish the prayer, and the time of the discussion between the Prophet ﷺ and Dhul Yadayn, that amount of time has not passed, I can go back and pray that other rak'ah as a standalone rak'ah. That's what he means by if one remembers it soon after its omission. So again, that hadith of Dhul Yadayn is important because when the Prophet ﷺ returned to the prayer to pray the 2 missing rak'ahs, he didn't pray all of this. He added those 2 to the previous 2. So as long as that gap is not longer than that discourse that took place between the Prophet ﷺ and Dhul Yadayn radiallahu anhu, then you can add the rak'ah or rak'at that you missed for the arkan. Okay, so either you're going to miss it in the prayer and remember it in the prayer, then you go back to it, or you are going to remember it after the prayer and not too much time has passed, you add the rak'ahs needed to cover that. Or in the case that you forgot, oh my God, today for Fajr I forgot to recite the Fatiha, then you would consider that Fajr batil, it didn't count, so you'll just pray a qada of 2 Fajr. Okay? Now all of these are in scenarios in which you are on your own. Now if you're an imam and you forget that, and let's say that no one has corrected you, now if you're the imam, you have even more of a responsibility because you got all these people behind you that are following you. So let's say the imam misses a rukn of the prayer. Usually, it's kind of hard to make a scenario, but let's keep going with our scenario. He just started with Surah Al-Ikhlas or something like that. Now, you have to say the Fatiha. right? Because it's a fard, it's a rukn for you. In the Shafi'i madhab, we talked about that. But if the congregation doesn't warn him, then the same rules would apply. He would have to pray that rak'ah over if he wasn't able to redo it in the middle of the prayer. There'll be more examples with the jama'ah as we keep discussing. Okay, now what happens if you forget a sunnah act? One does not return to a recommended action after engaging in an action that is obligatory. One does, however, make a prostration for forgetfulness for its omission. So in the sunnah acts, which we said are dua al-qunut of Fajr prayer, the middle tashahud, praying on the Prophet ﷺ and his family in the 2 tahiyyats. You don't go back to that after you have engaged in the rukn, the following rukn. So let us use the dua al-qunut of Fajr as an example. I'm coming up from ruku' on my last rak'ah of Fajr, Sami Allahu liman hamida. This is where the dua is. I forget Allahu Akbar, and just as I said Allahu Akbar, I remembered the sunnah. I can stand and I can make the dua. But if I said Allahu Akbar and I start motioning and I'm on my way down, khalas, I have talabbus of the next rukn. I have put on the garment of the next rukn, so my body is engaged in that next rukn. I can't leave that rukn for the sunnah. You can't leave the higher for the lesser. That would invalidate the prayer. So in that case, khalas, I just missed it. But because it's a sunnah, we have a way of compensating for it, which is again to pray the sajdatay as-sahu. In the first example, the arkan, I forgot to mention, in all of those scenarios, we also will pray the sajdatay as-sahu because it is a compensation for the stutter step that we took in the prayer, the redoing and the forgetfulness, not to compensate a missed rukn. Whereas in here, with the sunnah that we miss, we are compensating for the missed sunnah. Now, as regards to praying in jama'ah, so he has a nice ta'bir, Imam al-Bayjuri has a nice statement. He says, فَتَجِبُ فِيهِ الْمُوَافَقَةِ تَرْكًا لَا فَعْلًا. So we as the followers of an imam in prayer, we are obligated to follow him when he leaves something, but not when he does something that he's not supposed to do. So if the imam forgets the middle sunnah and stands, as the followers, we have to stand with him because now we have engaged, or he has engaged in the higher act, which is the rukn, not the sunnah. So we can leave that act with him. But if the imam leaves a rukn, we can't leave the rukn, we have to do that rukn and then continue the prayer. Okay, so the sunnah acts, you forget them. If you can capture them before you adorn yourself with the next rukn, before you have moved into the next rukn, you can do them. If you forget them and you've moved into the next rukn, you move to the next rukn and you don't worry about them, and then you pray the 2 sajdas sahu at the end of prayer. Okay, the lesser recommended acts, the hayat, which was that long list of things, about moving your hands and saying Allahu Akbar and all of these refined things about the prayer. He says, radiyallahu anhu, one does not return to a lesser recommended action after its omission, nor make a prostration for forgetfulness for its omission. So those are things, if you did them, great. If you didn't do them, there's no compensation for them. There's nothing for you to make up at that point. Okay. Now, another thing to discuss, which is people, when they pray, if they have doubt of how many rak'ats they have prayed. So he says, radiyallahu anhu, if one has doubts concerning how many rak'at one has completed, one takes the certain number, which is going to be the least of the possibilities, prays the rest, and performs a prostration of forgetfulness. So, if I'm praying Dhuhr, for example, and I can't remember if I've prayed 2 rakahs or 3 rakahs. When I have a low number and a high number, there will always be certainty will be more in the lower number. And the percentage of doubt in the higher number is increased. But the lower number is for sure I've done that, maybe I've done more. So whenever you're doubting how many rakahs, you always, as we read in the hadith, you always default to the lower number, and at that moment I move the doubt out of my mind completely, and I say khalas, automatically, did I pray 2 or 3? Automatically the answer is I prayed 2. Then I'm going to keep going and pray 3rd and 4th rakah. Now, because of that doubt that has occurred, there is a opportunity to pray, to do the 2 forgetfulness prostrations before the taslim. And if it turns out that you did pray 3, not 2, so therefore your entire dhuhr you prayed 5 rakahs, the Prophet ﷺ said this is a way of like annoying the shaitan, and it's more reward for us. So no harm, no foul in that case. It's just extra ibadah, extra reward. But this is a situation that occurs very frequently with people, that they forget how many rakats they have done in their prayer. Now, how about this prostration that we've been talking about? How is it done and when is it done? The prostration for forgetfulness is recommended. So itself, it is a sunnah. So you don't have to do it. And if you don't do it, then your prayer is still valid. Or if you forget to do it, then again your prayer is still valid. But because it's a sunnah, we want to stick to it because it's something that's important. And he says that the location of the prostration for forgetfulness is before saying the first closing Assalamu alaikum. So you would sit in the last sitting, finish the entire tahiyyat, tashahud tahiyyat, and then before saying Assalamu alaikum, say Allahu Akbar. You go down for sujood, Allahu Akbar. Another one, Allahu Akbar. Subhana rabbil a'la, subhana rabbil a'la, subhana rabbil a'la. Allahu Akbar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So all of these scenarios that we talked about, it all culminates in that one act at the end. So the sajdat as-sahw, therefore, can be done for multiple reasons and multiple purposes, but it looks the same. It is done as after the tashahud, before the taslim. Okay, and then we talk about the next subject, or we'll begin by talking about it, about when it is, the times that it is unlawful to pray. So the first thing is, he says that it's unlawful to perform a prayer that lacks a cause. The prayer has 3 causes. Either there is a cause before the prayer that causes that prayer, or there is a cause that is concurrent with the prayer, or there is a cause that is after the prayer. So here we look at the sabab. Why are you praying? What is the reason of the prayer? If the reason of the prayer is that there is a prior reason or a concurrent reason, then it does not fall into this list. But if the reason comes after the prayer, then it falls into this list. So what does that mean? Let us say that I have prayers that I have to make up in the past, prayers that are qada. Is the cause of those prayers prior, concurrent, or after? It's prior. The cause has happened in the past. In the sequence of time, it happened in the past. Their cause already happened, and I missed them. So I have to pray them. So therefore, making up prayers does not fall in this list. In other words, I could make up my prayers even during the times that we're going to learn it's haram to pray during. Why? Because the cause of that prayer has happened in the past. What is a cause that is concurrent? I walk into a mosque. There is the sunnah to greet the mosque, the tahiyatul masjid. That's a concurrent reason for praying the tahiyatul masjid. So if I walked into the masjid for some reason at these times, I could pray the greeting of the mosque, the greeting prayer of the tahiyyat, because it is happening at the same time. What is a cause that's after? The 2 rakahs that you pray sunnah after the tawaf in Umrah and at the Maqam Ibrahim alayhi salam. That's after. After you've done the tawaf, then there's the 2. So let's say you made Umrah after Fajr prayer and it's very crowded, and by the time you did the 7, well, praying after Fajr before sunrise is the first one, and the second one is as the sun is rising. So if you were making Umrah, for example, and you were doing your tawaf at that moment after Fajr, then you wouldn't go to Maqam Ibrahim and pray the 2 rak'ah sunnah. What's another example? A prayer that whose cause is after Salatul Istikhara. Because the reason you are doing the Salatul Istikhara is that after the Salah, after the Salah, you're going to make the dua of Istikhara. Allah help guide you to make a decision between things. Or another example that is common in the books of fiqh is Salatul Tasabih, that you do it for reward. So that's something that happens afterwards. Or I just want to pray for the sake of praying. That's its cause is afterwards. It's for the sake of seeking the reward of that prayer after it's done. So, sorry to be so technical, but it's important because, it's even in the matan, but now you understand the differentiation between prayers whose causes is before the act of the prayer, whose cause is concurrent with the act of the prayer, and whose cause is afterwards. Now let us go back to the text and see what he says, and let's see if it makes more sense to us now. It is unlawful to perform a prayer that lacks a cause, meaning concurrent with or arising prior to the prayer's performance during 5 times. So now we know what that means. So there are many exceptions to this. Number 1, after the dawn prayer until the onset of sunrise. You pray your Salatul Fajr, khalas. Then you wait if you are able to and make dhikr, read Quran, do your studies, read hadith, do these acts of qurbah until the sun rises. And then after the sun rises, you can pray the duha prayer. That's how the Prophet ﷺ did it. But there's no prayer afterwards. So you don't finish the Fajr prayer and you're like, I'm feeling really good today. I want to pray a couple of extra rak'ahs lillah. You must do it for the sake of Allah. You can't do that. Or, opposite, I was traveling yesterday or I was sick and I missed 5 prayers. So today after Fajr, I'm going to make up those 5 prayers. That's fine because it has a previous cause. So, the sunnah, as I said, is to pray. Obviously, the sunnah, as we said, with all of the times of prayer, with very few exceptions, like on a very hot summer day, dhuhr prayer can be delayed. But other than that, exception, the sunnah is to pray the prayers in the beginning time. So the sunnah is to pray Fajr, the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, lie on your side for a moment, get up, pray the Fajr prayer, and then sit in a state of dhikr until the sun rises. And of course, if you do that, the Prophet ﷺ, and then you pray, the Prophet ﷺ says you get the reward of a Umrah. And then the last one we'll discuss for this class is when the sun is rising until the completion of the sun, 1 spear above the horizon. So as the disk is actually rising, then we don't pray at that time until it is 1 spear length above the horizon, which is an actual measurement, which is 70 arm lengths. I forgot to, before the class, get the exact meters of it. I'll have that for the follow-up class, inshallah. But it's an actual measurement. And then therefore, after the sun has risen, a few feet or a few meters above the ground, then that haram time has moved, and then you can say a prayer. Again, the exception being prayers that have a previous cause or a concurrent cause. Okay, before I wrap up, I promised that I would get you the distance of the rumh. The rumh, 1 spear's rumh, is 7 hand or 7 adra, and there's a difference of opinion sometimes with these measurements in the madhahib, but for the Shafi'i madhab, that comes up to be 4.3 meters. So when the sun, from our perspective, is 4.3 meters above, that last haram time would cease and one can pray. And then in the next class, I will actually start with this one just to make sure that the conversation is smooth. Alhamdulillah, we were able to talk about the forgetfulness in prayer, and then we learned about some of the times in which we learned about what happens when we forget different things in the prayer, whether we forget a rukn, or whether we forget a sunnah, or whether we forget a hay'ah. And we talked about how forgetting the rukn, nothing can compensate that other than going back to doing the rukn, but because of that stutter step, we would do the sajdatul sahu. Forgetting a sunnah, we don't go back to it if we have already engaged ourselves in the next rukn, but if we haven't, we can do it. And if we miss it, then we can do the sajdatay sahu. If we forget the hay'ah, there is no sajdatay sahu. And if we are confused about how many rak'ahs we have prayed, we automatically default to the lower number, build on that, and pray the sajdatay sahu. The two prostrations of forgetfulness for all of those scenarios takes place at the last rak'ah, after the tahiyyat, before the taslim. You do two sajdas, and then assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Next, we talked about the times in which prayer is prohibited. But before we talked about that, we learned that each prayer can have three causes. There can be a cause before the prayer, a cause concurrent with the prayer, or a cause after the prayer. In the discussion of when prayers are prohibited, we are talking about prayers who have a cause after the prayer. Those prayers are prohibited during the times that we are going to discuss. However, prayers that have a previous cause, such as missed prayers that I haven't prayed, or have a concurrent cause, such as I'm going to greet the mosque, the Tahiyyatul Masjid, those prayers can take place at the times in which prayer is prohibited. But the prayers who have a cause afterwards, the examples that we gave are the two rak'ahs of the tawaf, the istikhara prayer, and tasabih prayer. Those prayers are the types of, or just random, I want to pray for the sake of praying, those are the prayers that are prohibited during these times. The first two times we talked about is after you pray Fajr until the sun rises. And then the last one we discussed for this clip is when the sun is rising until it's about 4.3 meters above the horizon. And then we'll continue in the next class, inshallah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.